I currently live in a house with my younger sister. The two of us share one car. We kept it in what we call the garage, although it's really more of a covered parking space. One of the rooms on the second floor extends over it and acts as a roof, but otherwise it's fairly open. Anyone passing the house could see straight inside. Since it offered almost no security, my sister bought a motion-activated light and installed it there. A few days later, someone from the house opposite spoke to her. They didn't complain outright, but apparently they mentioned that our garage had been brightly lit in the middle of the night for the last few days. And it was becoming a nuisance. They assumed that I was going out there to work on the car, but of course I wasn't. The only reasonable explanation I could think of was that somebody had been entering the garage at night. If it was a thief, they were incredibly bold. From what the neighborhood said, they had been coming back almost every night. So I decided to wait for them. The downstairs toilet is the closest room to the garage, so that night I sat inside with the light off. I passed time by scrolling on my phone. Shortly after the digital clock went past 1 in the morning, I noticed the garage light come on through the toilet window. I quietly left the toilet. I had put a broom outside beforehand, in case I needed something to defend myself with. After checking it was still within reach, I opened the front door slightly and looked towards the garage. There was enough space inside for 2 cars, but we only owned one, leaving a large section of the concrete floor empty. The sensor light was shining across that empty space. A man was standing in the middle of it, with his back to me. My first thought was that I should yell and try and frighten him away, but I decided to watch him just to see what he would do. The longer I watched him, the weirder his actions seemed to be. He wasn't looking through the car windows or checking whether the doors were locked. He didn't appear concerned that the light had come on either. He was simply standing there. "What are you doing?" I meant for it to come out quite sharp, but it came out much weaker than I intended. The man responded by slowly turning towards me. As soon as I could feel his eyes, I felt goosebumps across my arms and neck. There was no expression in them at all. They reminded me of the eyes of a dead fish, dull, clouded, and completely uninterested in what was happening around him. I kept looking at him, unsure of what I was supposed to do. Without warning, the man began staggering backwards. He moved beyond the reach of the light, and after that I couldn't tell where he had gone. I felt uneasy, but I wasn't going to go following him into the darkness. Eventually I went back inside and I went to bed. The following night, I decided to watch the garage again, just in case he returned. Sure enough, a little after 1 a.m., the sensor light came on again. I went to the front door and I looked outside, expecting to find the same man. This time, there was a woman standing in the garage with her back to me. It wasn't the man. For some reason, that made me lower my guard. "What are you doing out here?" I spoke to her a little more politely than I had spoken to him, and the woman slowly turned around and started staggering out of the garage area. As soon as I saw her face, I knew I had made a mistake, because she had exactly the same eyes. They were dull and empty. Just like the man's, just like the dead fish. I didn't wait to see where she went. I pulled the front door shut and I locked it. After that, I couldn't make myself go outside whenever the garage light came on. All I could do was sit in that dark toilet and watch the light through the frosted window. It continued happening. Before long, I was struggling to concentrate at work during the day. I kept thinking about that garage and what might be standing beneath the light while I hid inside the house. Eventually, I reached my limit though. One night, I forced myself to look. I couldn't have this happening on my property. I was worried about my sister. so I opened the frosted glass toilet window. There were iron bars across it, you see. So I pressed my face close to them. I felt safe enough to do so, and I tried to see as much of the garage as possible. From that angle, part of it was still hidden. I pushed my face farther between the bars, just a little more, and I would be able to see the exact spot where the man and woman had been standing. Those clouded eyes were suddenly right in front of me. I swore, and I shoved the frosted window closed. The figure remained on the other side for a few seconds, reduced to a shadow behind the glass before moving away in that familiar way. Almost immediately, the front door beside the toilet began shaking in its frame. I assumed that whoever had been at the window had gone around to the entrance and was testing the handle. I knew I had locked it earlier, but standing there in the dark, listening to it rattle, I started doubting myself. Eventually, I made myself leave the toilet and go and check, and the front door was still locked. I pressed the handle down from the inside. It didn't move. I had no intention of opening the door to see what was outside. While I was standing by the front of the door, the rattling stopped. I waited for the footsteps to start moving away, but I heard nothing. A short time later, the garage light went out. There was a window in the ground floor living room that faced the garage. I didn't particularly want to look, but I needed to know whether whoever was out there had gone before I went upstairs to wake my sister. I kept the room dark and I moved one edge of the curtain aside. Initially, I could only see the garage and the patch of the driveway in front of it. Then the sensor light came back on, and I saw several people standing outside directly in front of the window. Their faces were level with mine. Some were partly hidden behind the others, but every one of them was staring into the living room with the same dull, clouded deadfish eyes. I let go of the curtain and backed away. None of them tried the door again, and as far as I could tell, they never tried to enter the house. I just stayed downstairs until the light went out, then went upstairs and waited outside my sister's bedroom until the morning. Once it was light outside, I went and checked through the living room window, and the driveway was empty. That morning, I removed the sensor light, and I told my sister that it was disturbing the neighbors, which of course was partially true. After we removed it, the garage stopped lighting up in the middle of the night. The neighbor never complained again, and neither my sister nor I saw any of those people afterwards. I don't know whether the light attracted them or merely allowed me to see them. All I can say is they started appearing a few days after we installed it, and once it was gone, they apparently stopped coming. Hi, Jay here. Just a quick thought before we continue. This story was so unique I wanted just to look into it a little. The original Japanese does not describe the people as having literal fish eyes. It uses the expression shinda sakana no you name, which means eyes like a dead fish, meaning a dull, emotionless gaze with no sign of life behind it. So as far as I can tell, these aren't a recognized group of fish-eyed people from some sort of Japanese folklore. And I couldn't find any particular yokai or urban legend that cleanly lines up to this story. But the light itself is kind of an interesting and important detail. We normally say moths are attracted to light, although some research, which I've looked up off the back of this, suggests that artificial point lights interfere with insects' sense of which way is up. So what happens is they become sort of trapped, they circle around it, and those gatherings can attract predators as well, including bats, spiders, you've seen it, you know what I'm on about. Perhaps the sensor light created something similar here, a fixed patch of brightness in the darkness where these people gathered at night. I guess there's one other possibility there. Maybe they had always been visiting the garage, and installing the light simply allowed the narrator and his neighbor to notice them. He says they never came back after the light was removed. Well, with nothing left to illuminate the garage, or announce that they were coming. I'm not sure how he could know that. At the time, I was working for a major security company. This story was told to me by one of the other guards. I'll call him Mori. Mori had been sent from Tokyo to Kobe to help with overnight maintenance work on the Hanshin Express. Being sent all that way as extra support made the job sound more unusual than it really was. The work itself wasn't especially difficult, and it was much the same as a large-scale expressway they regularly carried out in Tokyo. Their job was to close off certain lanes and prevent ordinary traffic from entering, used by construction vehicles, and that was basically it. The inconvenient part was that they were working on an expressway. Unlike ordinary roadworks, they couldn't simply leave the site when they needed food or the toilet. Everyone brought their own meal and ate somewhere safe within the work zone. As for the toilet, they were told they would have to just hold it until the work finished. That night, Mori was stationed roughly halfway along the work zone. He was controlling the construction vehicles entering and leaving the site. The work had begun at 8 in the evening, and before he knew it, midnight had passed. The new guard, named Sato, had been assigned to the very front of the work zone. His job was to wave an illuminated traffic baton, so approaching drivers would notice the lane closure and wouldn't accidentally drive into the construction area. It was probably the most important position on the site. At some point, Mori noticed Sato running towards him in a panic. He had left his position completely unattended. Mori immediately shouted at him, "Hey, Sato! Get back there, I told you! If you need the toilet, just hold it!" Sato came shaking his head as he ran. "No, that's not it! I saw something!" Mori wasn't interested in listening to excuses. "Just get back to your post!" And by the time Sato reached him, he looked close to tears. "No, I'm not going back. Something appeared back there. I can't do it. I can't do it." He wouldn't explain himself properly, and he refused to return to the front. Mori eventually gave up arguing. He told Sato to take over his position in the middle of the work zone, and he headed towards the front himself. Thankfully, nothing had happened while the position was unattended. Mori picked up the illuminated baton and began directing traffic in Sato's place. More than an hour passed without anything unusual happening. What's he so frightened of? Mori wondered. Around that time, he noticed movement on top of the barrier in the central reservation. At first, he couldn't tell what he was looking at. It was a middle-aged man. From his clothes, he clearly wasn't one of the workers. He was wearing an ordinary button-up shirt, and he was standing on the barrier, looking across into Mori's lane. Now, Mori assumed he had some sort of vehicle trouble. Perhaps the man's car had broken down on the opposite carriageway, and he was trying to reach the emergency telephone about 20 meters farther along on Mori's side. Even though it was well after midnight, there were a few vehicles on the road. Most of them were still traveling at close to 100 kilometers per hour. A car that appeared to be some distance away could be beside them within seconds. Trying to cross those lanes on foot was far too dangerous, especially at night. "Hey! It's dangerous! Don't move!" Mori shouted as loudly as he could. The man just straight up didn't acknowledge him. His body seemed to sway slightly. He stepped down from the central barrier into Mori's lane and began walking slowly towards the emergency telephone. "Go back! You're gonna get hit!" Mori shouted again, but the man just continued walking. A large truck was approaching, its engine making a tremendous amount of noise. The driver didn't seem to have noticed the man. The truck wasn't slowing down at all. Its headlights fell directly across him. At that moment, the man disappeared. It was almost as if he had dissolved into the beam from the headlights. The truck continued past Mori, without stopping. Mori stood there, trying to understand what he had just witnessed. There had been no impact, and the truck driver hadn't reacted to a single thing. He remembered what Sato had said, and he shuddered. So that's what he was talking about. Mori had only just gotten himself together, and was about to continue working when he noticed something moving in the central reservation. The same man was back. He was slowly peering into their lane, just as he had done before. I feel as though I've heard a similar story somewhere before. Apologies if it's already been posted. My senior and a few friends had gone into the mountains. They were only a short distance from a village at the foot of the mountain, but they preferred camping away from inhabited areas. They decided to spend the night partway up the slope, somewhere they could still see the village below. They found two large flat rocks side by side. The rocks made a convenient place to prepare dinner, so they cooked and ate there. Once they'd cleaned everything up, they pitched their tent between the two rocks. A narrow mountain track ran past the side of the tent. It looked more like an animal trail than a maintained path. Sometime after midnight, my senior woke up. Something resembling people talking was coming from farther down the mountain, and the voices seemed to be getting closer. As he lay there trying to work out what was going on, he noticed a metallic ringing from the opposite direction. It sounded like several shakujo. These are Buddhist staffs fitted with those loose metal rings, so they make a distinctive sound when carried. That noise was coming from higher up in the mountain. My senior knew that something was wrong, and he woke the others. They stayed inside the tent, frightened and unsure of what to do. The sounds continued approaching until small lights became visible through the tent's fabric, similar to lanterns. The voices were climbing from the direction of the village, while the shakujo were coming down from somewhere above them. Just as my senior thought they were in serious trouble, the flap over the tent window was pulled open. A man of around 60 was peering inside. My senior and his friends almost screamed. The man looked at them and said, "What are you lot doing in a place like this?" It took them a moment to realize that he was just an ordinary person. Feeling embarrassed as much as relieved, they climbed out of the tent. A whole procession had stopped outside. Everyone wore black mourning clothes. Each person had a triangular piece of paper placed against their forehead, something the original poster called a sunboshi. At the front of the procession, about 4 people were carrying a zakkan, an old tub-shaped coffin used for earth burial, with the deceased placed inside in a seated position. It hung suspended from the frame that they carried. It was a funeral procession, traveling through the mountains in the middle of the night. Well, my senior and his friends were told that in that area, burials were carried out late at night because of beliefs surrounding ritual impurity. The funeral itself would be held the following day. There was something else they hadn't known. Farther along the path, beyond the place where they had put up their tent, was a burial ground used specifically for earth burials. The villagers regarded the place where they had been sleeping as the boundary between this world and the next. Only a small number of people carried the coffin all the way to the burial ground where it would be interred. My senior and his friends had little choice but to pack up and sleep in the village instead. Once they were there, they asked one of the villagers about the shakujo they had heard coming up from higher in the mountains. The villager answered, "That would have been the welcoming party from the other world, if we'd arrived even a little later." He left the sentence unfinished. The following day, my senior and his friends went to the shrine of the village's guardian, Kami, and apologized for what they had done. After that, they left the village. I was never told exactly where this happened. I wonder whether customs like that still survive anywhere. I left a few details out earlier because I thought it was taking too long to reach the point. But there was more to the explanation. Apparently it was a very small village in a narrow area of the mountains. Because there wasn't enough space for the burial ground to keep expanding, the place where people were physically buried was kept separate from the cemetery containing their gravestones. The actual burial sites were reused. When another burial was needed, an older plot would be dug up again. Any remains found in the soil were placed inside a small box and reburied beneath the new coffin. The 2 flat rocks where my senior and his friends prepared and ate their dinner were almost exactly the right size to hold a zakan. The lower rock represented this world, and the upper rock represented the next. The relatives moved the coffin from the lower rock to the upper one, and that was where they would say their final goodbye. Afterwards, a selected group of people who were not relatives took over and carried the coffin the rest of its way to the burial ground. In other words, the place where my senior and his friends had eaten dinner and gone to sleep served almost the same purpose as the Sanzu River, the crossing between the living and the dead. In that sense, it may have been more frightening than the burial ground itself. Hi, Jay here. Just had a little look through the comments on this one. One commenter pointed out that earth burial is still possible in some parts of modern Japan, and that is broadly correct. Japanese law does not ban it outright, although cemeteries that permit it are now extremely rare, and cremation is overwhelmingly standard. Most of the remaining comments are just puns involving shakujo, earth burial, and falling over inside a tent. They're not very helpful, and there aren't any further accounts of people claiming to know the village. Japanese law does not prohibit earth burial nationally, but authorized sites are exceptionally rare. 99.97% of dispositions recorded in 2022 were cremations. So, what those lads saw on the mountains on that dark night was something exceptionally rare. Hi, Jay here. Now this one is admittedly a little out there, but people have been asking me for ages about some stories about modern day yokai, and perhaps that's what these 2 strangers encountered during a late night train ride. Whatever they saw, neither of them seems to have had any explanation for it. I was riding the second to last train of the night. There were only 2 of us in this carriage, me and a fairly scruffy older man sitting diagonally across from me, a little to my right. He was drinking. At first I thought, come on man, don't drink on the train. But I couldn't smell it from where I was sitting, so I decided it wasn't my problem, and I just went back to looking at my phone. Something good had happened in my love life that evening, so I was in a pretty good mood. It had just been the 2 of us for most of the journey, when the train stopped at one of the stations. I noticed a salaryman standing on the platform outside the nearest door to the older man. I didn't pay much attention to him. I just carried on looking at my phone. "What are you looking at?" The voice was strangely mechanical. I looked up and the salaryman's face was right beside me. He was grinning and leaning over to look at my phone. My first thought was just, what the hell is wrong with this guy? But once I got a better look at him, I realized that his body wasn't inside the carriage. It was still on the platform. Only his neck had stretched through the open door all the way across the carriage like Rokurokubi. The older man was still holding his drink, but he'd gone completely still. From the look on his face, he could see the salaryman as well. I couldn't bring myself to look back at the face beside me, so I kept staring at the older man. Eventually, the melody warning that signals that the train doors were about to close started to play, and the salaryman didn't seem interested in getting aboard. His face began sliding back towards the platform, still grinning, letting out a long sound. I started to feel relieved. His head was almost outside when the doors closed. They caught his neck before it had completely withdrawn, though. Looking back, I still wonder about the conductor. Couldn't they see him? Why would they close the doors on a guy with his neck still in the door frame? Although maybe he wasn't a Rokurokubi. Maybe he was some sort of rubber man. His neck stretched, was flattened between the doors, but the salaryman continued grinning. The train began to move. Because his neck was still trapped, it stretched farther and followed the train. Through the window, I could see his body remaining perfectly upright on the platform. It gradually moved towards the back of the train as we pulled away from it. That salaryman kept making this strange laughing sound. His face whipped from side to side, smacking against the doors, but he was still being dragged along. I was shaking and wishing it would stop. Eventually, I suppose his neck reached the limit of how far it could stretch. It slipped through the gap in the doors with a pop and disappeared into the darkness outside. At the next station, the older man and I both got off the train. He looked completely sober at that point. We were still shaken, and somehow we ended up going for a drink together. That face had been swinging around directly in front of him. Whatever I'd experienced must have been several times worse from where he was sitting. We didn't exchange contact details, but sometimes I wonder how that man's doing. This happened when I was in my first year working as a nurse. Back then I worked at a hospital that ran on a 3-shift system. That night I was on the late shift, and I came in at around 11:30 p.m. At that hour most of the hospital was already dark, only the bare minimum lights were left on. The changing room was in the basement, and to get there I had to go down the stairs and pass in front of the morgue. I've always been easily scared, so during the day, going past there alone made me feel pretty uneasy. If no other staff were around, I'd still feel a little creeped out. On a night shift, it was much worse. There were fewer people in the building, and sometimes I'd be completely alone in the changing rooms. That night was one of those nights. Now, as far as I could tell, I was the only one down there. I kept telling myself, just don't think about it. And I got changed as quickly as I could. I headed straight back upstairs. I didn't linger. I just grabbed my things, shut my locker, and made for the stairs as quickly as I could. At the time, I worked on the 10th floor ward, so I always used the elevator to get upstairs. To reach the elevator hall, I had to pass through the waiting room. When the automatic doors opened, I noticed it straight away. There was someone lying on one of those long benches in the dark waiting room, turned towards me. The room wasn't completely black. A faint light from the corridor and the dim night lighting the hospital reached far enough for me to make out the shape of a person stretched across the bench. Their face was angled in my direction, and they were smiling. Even now, that's the part I remember most clearly. It wasn't a normal expression, not like the relaxed face of someone half asleep or somebody amused by something. It looked like a grin that had already been there before I came through the doors. as though they had been lying in the dark with that expression fixed on their face, waiting for someone to step out of the elevator. In that weak light, I could still see the curve of their mouth, and that's what made it so hard to shrug off. The smile was too clear. I was so startled that I couldn't move forward. I just stood there staring for longer than I wanted to. I couldn't bring myself to walk out of the elevator and into the waiting area. I remember thinking that maybe it was a patient, someone from another ward, that may have wandered off. That happens sometimes. Patients got confused at night, especially in large hospitals, and they end up in places they're not supposed to be. So there was a perfectly normal explanation there. Even so, I couldn't make myself call out. That was the strange part. If it had only been a patient, I should be able to say something. You know, "Are you alright? Which ward are you from? Do you need any help?" Something simple, but I just couldn't do it. Something about the sight of that person lying there facing me, smiling in silence, put me off so badly that I didn't want to hear them answer back. And I know that that's not very professional. So I waited near the entrance, hoping for another member of staff to turn up, so I wouldn't be alone. I stayed there for a while, but there was no sign of anybody else. I couldn't even hear the sound of anyone approaching. My shift was getting closer, and I couldn't just stand there forever, so in the end, I had no choice. I made up my mind. I kept my eyes away from the bench, and I quick walked through the waiting room to the elevator hall. Even while I was passing through, I could feel where that bench was. I knew exactly where it was. I didn't look, but I was painfully aware of it all at the same time, like I'd feel something change if I turned my head even slightly. When I got up to the ward, I told one of the senior nurses what had happened. She said it was probably just a patient from another ward wandering around after all, and she went down to the waiting room to check, but when she came back she said that there was no one there. Later, after I'd been working in that hospital for a little while, I got wind of some rumors. Now, not official stories, just things staff mentioned to each other. Late at night, half seriously, half not. Someone seen in the waiting room when visiting hours were long over. Someone lying on a bench near the elevator hall, only for no one to be there when somebody else goes to look for them. I don't know how many of these stories were real and how many had been exaggerated in the retelling, but once I'd heard them, I couldn't stop thinking about that person's face. What I saw that night might have been a living person. I can't deny that. It may have been a patient smiling for some reason I just couldn't understand, who got up and left while I was standing near the entrance, working up the nerve to pass through. But sometimes I still think about how dark that waiting room was, and how I could clearly see a grin from the doorway. I checked it multiple times on the night shift. How clearly could I even see the bench itself? It wasn't that clear. So even now, I'm left with "I don't know" as the answer. I don't know whether that was a person, somebody alive, or somebody not. Many years have passed since then, but let me tell you this, I still don't like hospitals late at night. This happened when I was working night shifts at a convenience store. I'd been there for about 3 months when one night the senior colleague working with me asked, "Listen, would you mind if I stayed until the morning?" His shift was supposed to finish at 1. At our store, 2 people worked until 1 a.m. From then until 6 in the morning, whoever was on the overnight shift worked alone. I don't mind the company, but is something wrong?" I said to him. There wasn't any unusual work to be done that night, so I couldn't think of any reason for him to stay late. "It's got nothing to do with work, I've already clocked out. I just want you to let me sit in the office." The office was through a door behind the register. It was a long, narrow space containing a computer desk and a small changing area and shelves for stock. There was barely enough room for two people to squeeze past each other. He wanted to spend another 3 or 4 hours in there. Listen, don't you live nearby? Isn't it only about a 5-minute walk? Have you lost your key or something? He gave me an awkward smile, and he just said, "There's something I want to check, okay? Just don't laugh at me." He explained that when he was working the night shift alone, he would sometimes be sitting in the office and hear someone call out from the shop, "Excuse me," or in Japanese, "Sumimasen." The entrance chime wasn't always reliable. Wind or vibrations could set it off when nobody was there, and occasionally someone would enter the store without it sounding at all. So whenever he heard the voice, he would call back, "Sorry to keep you waiting," and he would come out of the office expecting to find a customer at the register. The shop would be empty though. On another night, he was working at the desk when the same voice called to him, "Sumimasen." That time he was sitting close to the door, so he stepped out into the shop almost immediately. But there was nobody there. It happened again on a different night, and as soon as he heard the voice, he checked the security monitors instead. No one appeared on any of the cameras inside the shop. The camera covering the area directly outside the entrance was completely empty as well. According to him, this had been happening once or twice a week. "Has anything like that happened to you?" he asked me. I work the night shift about twice a week myself, and I couldn't remember hearing anything like that. When I shook my head, he gave me the same uncomfortable smile. "I see." And he went back into the office. "Anyway, thanks for letting me stay." 2 hours passed and it was around 3 in the morning. We'd barely had any customers, and with my colleague helping, we had finished the night's work early. The two of us were just sitting in the office talking. We got onto the subject of strange customers. I was enjoying the conversation and had almost forgotten why he had stayed. "Sumimasen." The voice came from immediately behind me, on the other side of the office door. I looked at my colleague. He was already watching the security monitors. When he noticed me looking at him, he shook his head. There was nobody on the cameras. I was nervous, obviously, but there were blind spots around the register. There are a few areas near the counter that the cameras don't cover. I should probably go and check. I reached towards the door. "Wait!" My colleague shouted so suddenly that I stopped with my hand still raised. He pointed at one section on the monitor. "Look at this." The camera showed the area behind the register. Right at the edge of its blind spot, it caught the lower half of the door leading into the office. Long black hair was visible beside it, so were a woman's legs. She wasn't standing there. From the small part of her that appeared on the monitor, she seemed to be clinging to the wall. Her legs were pressed against it, while her long hair hid everything above her knees. That was all the camera could see. I couldn't turn around. The door was directly behind me. Set into it was a square window, about 50 centimeters across, positioned roughly between the height of my chest and the top of my head. The glass was one way. Someone on the shop side couldn't have been able to see into the office. Even so, I had the strong feeling that the woman was looking at me through it. "She's gone." My colleague's voice brought my attention back to the monitor. There was nothing beside the door anymore. This time there really was nobody there. I asked my colleague to stay until my shift finished, and he agreed. For the remaining half of that month, I went to work feeling nervous every night. I never did hear that voice again, and the woman didn't reappear on the monitor. And the following month, my colleague quit. I was curious, so I asked the owner what had happened. Apparently, on the night we saw the woman, my colleague had asked him how to review the footage recorded by the security camera, and the next morning he said he wanted to leave the job. "Wonder what that was about," the owner said. I don't think he was doing anything wrong. I got the owner to show me how to access the recordings. As soon as I was alone, I went through them. I found footage from before the night my colleague stayed with me. It was one from the shifts he had been working alone. He was in the office when the voice called from the empty shop. The recording showed him opening the door and coming out to serve whoever he thought was waiting, and it also showed her. At the very edge of the camera's blind spot, beside the office door, were woman's legs and long black hair. She was clinging to the wall in the same position as before. The office door opened. My colleague stepped out. He passed straight through her. That was probably what he had seen when he checked the recordings. I restored the monitor to its usual setting and decided to find another part-time job. In the end, though, I stayed there for another 2 years until I graduated from university. During that time, I occasionally asked the owner and the newer employees whether they had heard or seen anything strange, but none of them had. I still don't know what she was. Maybe she had already been attached to my colleague before he started working there. Or maybe she followed him when he left. Or perhaps she's still beside that office door and just nobody can see or hear her anymore. I have no idea, really. Hi, Jay here. I had another little look through the comments. Most of them are jokes, but a couple of readers picked up on something important. One person wondered whether the senior colleague recognized the long-haired woman, or at least had some idea who she might have been. The story never suggests that directly, but his behavior is pretty interesting. He didn't stay because he wanted to help out with dealing with the voice. He stayed because he wanted to confirm something, right? Once he watched the earlier footage and discovered that he had repeatedly walked through her, he quit the following morning. Another commenter pointed out that the woman never harms anyone. All she does is call for assistance and just sort of hang out by that office door. It doesn't make the situation much easier to accept, but when the shop is normally staffed by one person between 1 and 6 in the morning, yeah, I can imagine that being pretty creepy. There was also a later comment comparing the voice to hearing a telephone ring when it hasn't. Have you ever had that kind of experience? I've worked in retail before where you go home and you can almost hear the same sounds that you'd heard at work, if that makes sense. Something like that could probably happen if you worked at the same job for a long time. That might explain why one employee is imagining "Sumimasen" during a quiet shift, but I suppose it's a bit harder to dismiss that when the other person hears it and sees the same thing on the live monitor. But the most revealing detail may be what happens after the senior leaves. The OP stays at that store for another 2 years. It shocked me. Yet, he doesn't see anything else. Neither does any of the newer employees. Which leaves us with one sort of question to mull over, I suppose. If she was attached to the senior colleague who left, the question is whether she had already been there before, or whether she left the convenience store when he did, as the story suggests.